What is a podcast?
Okay, well, let that be the first.
So it's a children's book series
It's a game show.
about an armadillo named Lore. Did you know that baby armadillos are called armadiglets? Isn't that the cutest thing in the world? Armadiglets.
They do kind of look like piglets in
I
like
mean,
a way.
yeah, in some, yeah.
Okay. Yes. So can you just sort of give us a brief overview of Lore, stylistically, narratively?
Well, Lore is an exploration of dark history, right? So it's a storytelling podcast that dips into historical tales of things that are sort of on the edge of, we know something happened, but how can this have possibly happened, right? And some of the stories explored are those stereotypical horror tropes like vampires, werewolves, haunted houses. The TV show itself is just a visual adaptation of that. You know, it's still a historical storytelling moment where context is brought in, the details, the background behind certain things, and then the story is played out on the screen. It uses a mixed format of scripted, dramatic recreations. And recreations is that's probably a bad word to use because it's not like, you know, those non-dialogue recreations you see on cable networks, but it's scripted scenes cut from a movie, essentially, broken up with animation and found footage, and my voice is in there as the narrator, kind of weaving the pieces together and explaining why we're moving from point A to point B.
So, like I watched 3 of the episodes that you guys did, the Solid Changeling episode, and whatnot, and it's interesting because I've listened to your podcast. So it's interesting to watch you narrate these visuals and how they added in. So how did they do the actual screenplaying for these episodes to go along with your podcast now? So you have actors, they have lines, and how do you decide how much of that is podcast narration versus how much of that is actual actor portrayals of what you're talking about?
Well, I mean, I think it's one of those things that you kind of have to slide the levers every episode you film, because some of them you need more time with the on-screen characters to really go deep into the, I think about Echoes and the story of Walter Freeman and these, the ice pick lobotomies, right? Like literally pushing a metal spike through somebody's eye socket. And I can still hear the clink of the metal hammer on the metal ice pick, but you need to go deep into that character to really get where the story is. And others, you can step back a little bit. You can be a little bit more disconnected and teach a little bit more of the background information. And that's where my passion is. It's in, like, look, here is a story, and I can tell you this story. But if you understood these 3 things that happened in the 1850s, right, and that kind of informed this event, if you understood those first, then when I tell you the story, it makes so much more sense, and it becomes so much more powerful,
Can I ask one more question specifically about that episode?
Yeah.
At the end, when you were talking about that doctor, you kind of made the observation that even though everything you like described him as a horrible person, you might think he's a horrible person, and he is, but he genuinely felt like he was doing the right thing. And I thought that was weird that you put that in there. Like, you acknowledged that what he did was awful, but you also acknowledged that he was doing it with good intent. Is that from research, or is that your own assumption?
Well, it's a common thing that you'll find when you dig deep into these stories of people who do bad things. Oftentimes, especially somebody like Dr. Walter Freeman, he was a medical professional who really felt like, his goal was to remove the suffering that mental health patients went through on a regular basis. So he had this noble goal and went about it in a horrible way. And so people they're not black and white. It's not, there's a nuance to everybody where they might do monstrous things, but at the same time, they're still people, and they might have the best of intentions. And that's a quality of humans in general, is we're really good at going in with the best of intentions and screwing it up royally, and we do it time after time. So, and that hasn't changed, right? Because that's still our modern world today too. So, I think it's fair to look at somebody like him and say, was he a monster through what he did? Absolutely. But he was also trying to do something kind of noble, and that was okay, and like the trying was okay. The goal was okay, right?
Yeah. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries.
So can you talk a little bit about, you said this was a podcast, there's a book.
There is a book,
Yes.
coming out next week. Actually, there'll be 3 books.
3 books.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about those books and
Sure.
the process from turning to podcast to show to book?
Well, stories at the center of everything, right? I tell stories, and story can be adapted for any medium. So for a long time, it's been audio. Now it will be visual, and print is another one of those mediums that story can live very well on. And one of the reasons why the books are important is because if I tell a story about elves in Iceland, in the fall of 2015, and then a year and a half later I tell another story about like the Dover Demon or some other little person mythology, they're so far separated that you can't see the connections well. So what the books do are, there's 3 of them, so it's essentially people, places, and things. And the first book coming out next week is the Things book, Monstrous Creatures, and it's all of the ghostly spirit tales, all of the beastly werewolf tales, the undead, the things like that. And so when you put, say, like the Little People stories all together and you read them in an order, boom, 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 all of a sudden what you get is you're being reminded constantly of, oh, well, that detail popped up in the previous story, and you see how global mythology really is, and how this folklore, and sometimes in ways that it shouldn't be global. Why do the people of Indonesia tell stories that are almost identical to the people in Ireland about invisible, small, human-like creatures that you don't want to tick off or they'll make your life miserable? People in Ireland and Indonesia never communicated for thousands of years. Why in the world are they doing this? But when you see all the stories together in a book, it all clicks. It's like, oh my gosh, this is a global thing. Maybe it's part of who we are as people to tell these stories. So the books take stories from the podcast as well as new material and build that kind of curated collection of. Next week is Monstrous Creatures, and then Wicked Mortals will be about people who do bad things, and then the last book is Dreadful Places, and that is just about those places in our world that are just really creepy and messed up.
I'm sorry, quick follow-up. Can you talk a little bit about sort of like how you chose the stories for the podcast and why you chose stories for the show and then the stories for the podcast?
I don't have a good answer for how I choose stories because it's all intuition. I bump into a lot in my research, but I have to look at it and say, can I talk about this for 25 minutes? Or can I build an outline around this where there's a lot of historical background information that supports this one story? And not everything fits that bill. There's a lot of really neat stuff, like the suicide forest in Japan, right? You hear it talked about a lot. It's on Atlas Obscura. It's a creepy thing to hear about, but I can tell you the story in 60 seconds or less. There's a forest in Japan. People go there and they kill themselves. That's it. That's the story. Like, I can't do an episode on that, right? But then you bump into the story of, passing notes, where you have a family moving into a house, and through messing around with a seance and spiritualism, perhaps opened a door where things have come into this house and haunted. You can really talk about that, and you can dig in deep. And so my story finding process is just a matter of like sifting through those things, and shaking out, finding the big pieces that really work well as a story. And I don't throw stuff away. The suicide forest, maybe that gets filed away somewhere, and it becomes a historical context piece or an anthropological piece where I can say, well, in this culture over here, this also happens, and so nothing is. I use all the parts, right? I'm like a good butcher, but yeah, I'm like a good butcher. There's your headline.
With your success with the podcast, I was curious, outside of lore, if you had the chance to do a second podcast, what would you do?
If I told you, I'd have to kill you, and that might be the plot of the podcast. No, I've got some ideas bouncing around in the back of my head, and they may be closer to moving forward than they used to be. But that's about all I can say. At the end of the day, my love is tales of the unusual, the unexplainable, the bizarre, that kind of brush up against the historical, where there is that question at the end. How could this have happened, or did it really, and what influenced our perception of this? That's where I love to live, and lore does that, to the T for me. But I think there's other ways to do it as well.
I wanted to follow up with what you said, that there are people with good intentions. How do you approach the concept then? Do you believe in the idea of just pure evil?
We certainly have stories of people that it's easy to look at. I mean, look at H.H. Holmes, right? This guy that builds a mansion and then lets a bunch of people, mostly women, move in and then systematically kills them. And and doesn't just. It's not like this guilt-ridden, recluse killing people, but he did this almost like an assembly line to sell skeletons to anatomists and take money and.
With the business.
It was a business. It was cold. I mean, it was Walter White level, like slaughter without a heart. And I do think it's very hard to not see somebody of his caliber and say, is there pure evil? And even Holmes on his deathbed, writing his confession, talked about how, he really felt like he was born of the devil, right? And I'm not an expert in this. I can't say whether there is pure evil or not. I like to believe that everybody has hope of redemption in some form, right? Like that's the plot of so many movies. That's why we watch Breaking Bad, because we thought at some point Walter White's going to redeem himself. So I don't know, but there certainly are examples that make you wonder, right? How's that?
Thank you.
Okay. Can I? Yeah. You did have a question.
I was just wondering, in the course of your research, how important, during the course of your research, how important is it to interview people?
I never do that, mostly because they're all dead.
Do you travel then to like certain countries?
The beauty of the age we live in with technology is that I can stand on the street in Washington, D.C. and view a building as you would see it if you were standing in the street. But I can do it from my home on Google Street View. Like I can get a feel for what the setting is or whatnot. But thankfully, most of what I discuss is so far in the past. There's nobody to talk to about it. Instead of interviewing experts on topics, I tend to buy books on the topics because that's where the author or the expert, they've really taken the time to dig in deep for 200-300 pages and really explore an issue. So Black Stockings, one of the TV episodes, is about a woman named Bridget Cleary, and there's a book out there that you can pick up on Amazon called The Burning of Bridget Cleary. And it's an amazing exploration. I can't cover everything in a 25-minute podcast, but you'll get in there and you'll see newspaper clippings and a lot of stuff dealing with the trial, and it just becomes a much more rich story. So that's why whenever I, like with the books coming out, they've all got source material at the end to point people toward, like, look, if you like this story, here's a book you should go read because it's amazing. I will, for the first time, a book that the episode coming out on the 30th of this month, I'm actually on air going to recommend the book that I got a lot of the research from, because it was like, sometimes I get a bit from a book. This one was so influential just in the theme that I can't help but say, folks, you've got to go read this book. It's amazing. So I hope you do that. Yeah.
Excuse me, I'm gonna have to pull. I'm so sorry. We have to do a quick.
Can I get one more? She didn't get a chance to ask a question.
Real quick, I would ask what you'd want to do with the show in season 2. Sounds like that would have to strike
so much
you
more
later. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's so many episodes, right? I've put out 70 so far. There's a lot of really good stuff. I love Half Hanged, the story of Mary Webster, the witch who was hanged and then got up and walked away. Brought back the zombie episode. There's a lot of really good stuff in there that I can't wait to explore. So, thank you guys.
Thank you. You got this whole time. We'll bring some.